And with that, let's begin our first panel presentation. It'll address the topic of affirmatively furthering fair housing, a HUD and community perspective. The panel's discussion will focus on utilizing AFFH as a mandate to require HUD funding recipients to use those funds in a proactive manner to promote integration and opportunity. As the panelists join me on stage, let me introduce them to you. The Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity administers and enforces federal laws and establishes policies that make sure all Americans have equal access to the housing of their choice. Mr. Ed Wartts is the director of this program in the St. Louis HUD office. His office is responsible for investigating complaints of fair housing discriminations and monitors civil rights compliance reviews of HUD recipients. Mr. Maurice McGough, am I pronouncing that correctly? McGough. All right. Is the director of HUD's Region 5 Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which is comprised of 5 states, including Missouri and Illinois, among others. The Equal Housing Opportunity Council, EHOC, is led by Executive Director Mr. Will Jordan. EHOC was founded in 1992 and seeks to ensure equal access to housing and places of public accommodation for all people through education, counseling, investigation, and enforcement. For more than 20 years, it has been a grantee of the HUD Fair Housing Initiative program. And Dr. Molly Metzger is an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on affordable housing policy, racial segregation, and the deconcentration of poverty in American cities. Dr. Metzger's research explores the ways in which public policies interact and social structure and developmental factors to shape cities and lives. Thank you, panel, for joining us. Presenters will begin in our order of presentation here. So, Mr. Ed Wartts, the floor is yours.
It's my pleasure to be a part of the panel and to help to moderate the discussion that we're going to have this morning. The Fair Housing Act, first of all, was passed in 1968. And under the Fair Housing Act, one of the major focuses of the act was to combat and prevent segregation and discrimination in housing. This included the sale and rental of housing and the provision of advertising, lending, and brokerage services related to housing. The Fair Housing Act's declaration of policy states that it is the policy of the United States within constitutional limitations for fair housing throughout the United States. Now, that's a powerful mandate. Congress considered the realization of this policy to be of the highest priority. The Fair Housing Act's language prohibiting discrimination in housing is broad and inclusive. The purpose is to reach and to replace segregated neighborhoods with truly integrated and balanced living patterns. Section 808 of the Act says that the Fair Housing Act is required to affirmatively further fair housing and to provide this within constitutional limits throughout the United States. Now, the obligation to affirmatively fair housing, while it is directed to HUD, is also a requirement for HUD recipients. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how we use affirmatively furthering fair housing as a mandate. And I want to give you a little bit of history. Back in the Nixon administration, first HUD Secretary George Romney took this mandate very seriously, and he wanted to use it to integrate communities throughout the United States, not only from a housing standpoint, to also include all of the economic amenities that went along with that. And he had written a note indicating that this was his plan. And further than that, he went on to establish an initiative called Open Communities. And this is how he was going to tie HUD funding to the fact that affordable housing would be allowed in these communities that receive HUD funding. When President Nixon got wind of this, he was quite upset. He was adamant that this is not what we're going to do, and he wrote in a note to an aide, let's knock this in the head right now. So it doesn't go any further than this. In fact, the divide between Romney and Nixon was so significant that it resulted in Romney's resignation from Nixon's staff. So that's, that's the historical piece. And then I want to just bring it forward a little bit, deal with a little bit more history. Let's talk about the Kerner Report just for a minute. Back in the 1967s, actually during the riots, President Johnson commissioned the Kerner Commission to look at what was the nature of the protest that was going on in the communities around the country and what did the United States need to do to address those issues. And one of the most famous conclusions that was made by the commissions, and that is still very true today, is that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. But the commission made some really good recommendations in terms of how we needed to address those issues, which I think are still relevant today. And the first being, I may need to pull my glasses out to read these because I can't remember them from by heart.
That's okay.
The commission's suggestions included, but were not limited to, unless there are sharp changes in the factors influencing Negro settlement patterns within metropolitan areas, there is little doubt that the trend towards Negro majorities will continue. Providing employment for the swelling Negro ghetto population will require opening suburban residential areas to Negroes and encouraging them to move closer to industrial centers. The cities will have Negroes majorities by 1985, and the suburbs ringing them will remain largely all white unless there are major changes in Negro fertility rates, in migration settlement patterns, or public policy. We believe that the emphasis of the program should be changed from traditional publicly built slums-based high-rise projects to smaller units on scattered sites. And if you look around, and you'll notice that that is the approach that has been being taken by our housing authority over the last few years. Segregation, which the act was intended to eliminate, still remains quite significant nationwide, with St. Louis still being one of the most segregated cities in this country. We've moved from 4th on the list to 8th on the list, and that's an improvement. And while diversity is increasing in the St. Louis area, it has been limited to South St. Louis. And so North St. Louis is still entrenched racially, and with all of the other negative side effects that has in terms of lack of amenities, in terms of the poverty level, in terms of lack of jobs, in terms of housing that is not adequate to meet the needs of the community. One of the things, and I'll leave you with this and let my other panelists speak, but one of the things that was said recently by our former HUD secretary with regard to segregation is this. Former Secretary Sean Donovan said, "The folks fighting segregation aren't social engineering. Segregation was created by social engineering. Far more often than not, segregation, isolation, and poverty don't occur in spite of government. They happen because of government, by government dollars and government decisions made with government authority." So, government's hands are not clean. We work for HUD and we know the history of HUD, but now we're on the other side of the equation and looking to provide equal access in housing and all of the other amenities, and to reduce the segregated patterns that exist throughout this nation. Thank you.
So I'm going to be brief, but I just wanted to with Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, kind of share EHOC's philosophy on how we see it. So at the Equal Housing Opportunity Council, I've been there for about 11, going on 12 years. And one of the things that we realized in St. Louis is that everybody's got a different opinion about what the inner city and the North County issues are and how do you attack them, what comes first, what's most important. Even within the organized community of people who see that there's a real need to make something happen fast, there's not always agreement. So, and if anything's going to happen in St. Louis, you got to get agreement. You got to keep a team together, and you got to stay on the same issue until you get some victory. And so one of the things that I knew that we needed to do is we really needed to find who our partners were going to be, who was ringing out the best voice on what needed to happen in the future. So HUD was our first partner, also our first funder. You got to understand that. And so there's no way in the world that I'm going to go and be on a different page from HUD. And so for us at EHOC, we are a FIP program, which means that we are a private enforcement program, and that we are basically hired by HUD to get on the ground and do testing to find where there's discrimination, and then to bring those things, systemic issues, also with respect to cities that receive CDBG funding, and what are they doing with the money? Are they helping to desegregate? Or what's really happening within those cities? And so we've been doing that now for, since I've been there for over 11 years. And HUD has been our strongest partner on that level. Why is HUD our strongest partner? Well, we got great partners. The city of St. Louis is a good partner, but the city of St. Louis is not one voice, okay? There's a lot of different people in the city of St. Louis, and they are not always in agreement about what needs to happen first. And then we move out to St. Louis County, also a very strong partner, but a lot of different people are part of St. Louis County. Same thing when you go to the different municipalities, which are especially the ones that receive CDBG funding. A lot of voices within those places. So we had to find a strong voice that was saying the same thing. And right now in St. Louis, because things were so, with St. Louis going from the 4th most segregated to the 7th most segregated, but still that's not really a big change in the 12 years that I've been there. We needed to have a strong voice that was saying the same thing, and HUD was that voice. So we really support HUD in their programs, and we provide a lot of the on-the-ground investigation that they need. And by doing that, I think we've moved the ball forward quite a bit over the last 11 years. And then the next set of partners that we think have made a really difference are the community partners. And one of the plans we have at EHOC, and we've had for quite a long time, is that we plan on bringing more community people together, specifically dealing with affirmatively furthering fair housing, okay? What jurisdictions are getting money from HUD? What are the requirements? And as a community citizen, what would you like to see happening with that money? What do you think makes most sense? And what are the trends? And we're talking about analyzing not just the money that's happening and the affordable housing, but we're talking about looking at the governmental structure, the representation, the police department, its representation, the whole nine in light of Ferguson. Because even though the statute might not reach that, the people do. That's real for them. And we think that being relevant both to our partners with HUD and being relevant to the people in the community will make a difference. And it definitely has made a difference in our banking actions that we've done. And we want to see that happen with respect to community investment in cities as well. So you'll hear a little bit more about that, but you'll also be hearing, we want you to take a look at our Facebook page. We're going to be posting up some serious things coming up in the future about people coming together to talk about CDBG and affirmatively furthering fair housing, and how you show up at an analysis of an impediments hearing to talk about whether or not your city is doing the right thing with the money that they're getting from the government, because we think that is a really, really important piece.
If you don't mind, folks, I'm going to ask our panelists to come up to the podium and make their presentations.
I'd like to build a little bit about, build a little bit upon what Ed said as to the history of the Fair Housing Act as relates to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and a little bit on what Will said about citizens' participation as a mechanism for advancing an affirmatively furthering fair housing agenda. It was kind of interesting this morning when the moderator said that affirmatively furthering fair housing meant integration and opportunity. The fact that integration is linked with affirmatively furthering fair housing as far as HUD goes is a relatively recent event. The history that Ed talked about the conflict between Secretary Romney and President Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s really defined HUD's view of affirmatively furthering fair housing for the next 25 years. Following the resignation of Secretary Romney, the department was reorganized in such a way as to really marginalize the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, to mute any voice within the department that was advancing a pro-affirmatively furthering fair housing also known as Promoting Integration Agenda. That remained the case until the mid-1990s, when there was some reorganization within HUD and a greater awareness of the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, and there was an attempt to promulgate a new rule, a new federal regulation regarding entitlement communities' obligations to affirmatively further fair housing. And that rule was drafted after much consideration internally within HUD. It was put out for public comment, received extensive public comment over a period of 6 or 8 months, and was put into final form, but ultimately was not promulgated due to the opposition of a number of interest groups, including the National Conference of Mayors at that time, headed by the mayor of the city in which I work, the then Mayor Daley. The fact that affirmatively furthering fair housing means integration is, as I said before, a relatively new concept within HUD, but it's not relatively new to the overall scheme of the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. It was clearly Congress's intent to use the act as a means of promoting integration, and every court case, significant court case that has interpreted the obligation has determined that it also means promoting integration, going back to the early 70s and 80s in cases like Shannon and Otero and Boston NAACP versus HUD. The way that HUD looks to enforce the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is through a certification process. When an entitlement community, a city that receives community development block grant monies or home dollars, or a public housing authority that receives some sort of operating assistance, when they receive that money, every year they're obligated to sign a certification that says that they will affirmatively further fair housing, they will comply with other various civil rights obligations and statutes. And HUD generally accepts these certifications on their face as accurate. And we have done that routinely over the course of the last 30 years since the obligation has been in place. But something happened in the mid-90s that really kind of redefined how administrations, particularly this administration, was looking at that obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, and that happened in Westchester County, New York. Westchester County, New York, a fairly affluent county, suburban bedroom county for the most part to the city of New York. It received block grant money every year. The county executive every year signed a certification that the county was affirmatively furthering fair housing. The certification was signed, it was accepted by HUD, and the county received its block grant funds in return. So the county would sign this certification that they were affirmatively furthering fair housing, except they weren't. And this came to light by way of a private lawsuit filed on behalf of the United States. There's a mechanism whereby private citizens can file lawsuits in the shoes of the United States if they have evidence to establish that the government is being defrauded in some sort of contractual way. And this goes back, this law goes back to the Civil War. It was often called, it used to be called the Lincoln Law, because during the Civil War, there was a lot of profiteering, war profiteering going on, obviously, as there is in the case of most wars. And the Union was unable to address through normal mechanisms all of the ways that the government was being ripped off, all of the ways that contractors and suppliers were basically padding the bills that they would give to the government. So this mechanism was created where if I, as a private citizen, knew that the government was being ripped off, I could file a lawsuit. If I could prove that the government had been defrauded, I would not only get, I would be entitled to up to 3 times the damages that I was able to prove that the government had suffered. So back in the Civil War, if I could prove that a supplier that was supposed to have given 100 horses to the Union cavalry only delivered 50 but charged for 100, and I could prove that on behalf of the United States, then I would be owed 150 horses. So in today's world, most of this Lincoln Law, what's called the False Claims Act litigation, is around Medicaid fraud. You have a healthcare provider who's taking advantage of Medicaid. You have a disgruntled employee who stays late one night, goes into the files, copies a lot of bills that shows double entries and improper procedures. That person then walks across the street to the U.S. Attorney's Office or to the local False Claims Act office, files a case that proves that the doctor was taking advantage of the system. So how does this relate to the Fair Housing Act? So some very inventive attorneys representing a private organization, much like Will's, in Westchester County say, hey, Westchester County is getting all this money from the federal government based in part on their certification that they're affirmatively furthering fair housing, but they're not. And that's a false claim against the United States. And as a result of that, they were able to sue the County of Westchester, and entered into a settlement that resulted in over 700 new units of affordable housing being built throughout Westchester County, including in some of the most racially exclusive portions of the county. Now, what that False Claims Act litigation did was it actually commenced in the latter part of the Bush administration. But when you file one of these False Claims Acts, originally they're filed under seal. That is that the court, you file your papers, but they are not made public. And for a certain period of time, even the defendant does not know that they are being subjected to this lawsuit. And the reason for that delay is to allow the United States to assess the evidence that the relator, the person who's bringing the lawsuit, has, and to determine whether or not that evidence is sufficient for the United States itself to get involved, to not only leave the litigation to the private party who is suing on behalf of the United States, but to actively get involved in the litigation. So this case was filed under seal in the latter part of the Bush administration. Nobody knew about it. The United States had very little interest in it, and it was languishing in court. The administration changed. The Holder Justice Department looked at it and realized that this was a viable claim and got involved. And all of a sudden, it put a whole new spotlight on this obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, and it to a certain extent lit a fire under this administration to begin to take that obligation more seriously. The backlash that resulted from the Romney-Nixon dust-up that Ed was talking about really still haunts the bureaucracy to this day, and you'll see that within HUD itself there is a reluctance to aggressively, in some instances, really pursue affirmatively furthering fair housing, using HUD monies to promote integration. I'm going to give a very specific example of that out of my region, Region 5, which is the Chicago region, which includes the Midwest on the other side of the Mississippi River. And that is a case involving the city of Joliet. Joliet is a suburb of Chicago, about 60, 70 miles south of Chicago. Like a lot of communities within Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin, it relies heavily on gambling as a revenue source. And there is a casino that sits on the Des Plaines River, which is really sort of an economic engine, the casino that drives a lot of the economy for the city of Joliet. And right across the river on this beautiful bluff, close to downtown Joliet, there was a housing development called Evergreen Terrace. Evergreen Terrace was an assisted housing development that was built back in the late 70s. And it had about 350 units of assisted housing, almost exclusively occupied by African American, in many instances female head of households. And the city wanted it gone. The city wanted it gone for a couple of different reasons. The city wanted it gone because they wanted the land for economic development to dovetail with the with the casino, so you could build a hotel and some other amenities around the casino. They wanted it gone because the land was close to downtown and highly desirable. They wanted it down because they wanted the people gone. They wanted them somewhere else. And they came to HUD in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, looking for permission to tear the property down. Tear the property down, give the people who live there housing choice vouchers, and let them go out and try to find someplace to live on the private market, preferably someplace outside the town of Joliet. And HUD was relatively okay with that initially. They were looking at the dollars in a sense. They were looking at trying to accommodate the community's efforts to improve itself economically. They were looking at some of the investment opportunities that it would provide. And they were kind of okay with the notion of tearing down Evergreen Terrace until this whole notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing was advanced, and until Westchester came to the forefront. And all of a sudden, people started asking the questions. People in the community, people within the broader fair housing world, people within HUD began asking that question. How is the tearing down of Evergreen Terrace and the replacement of Evergreen Terrace with a hotel going to affirmatively further fair housing? How is it going to advance the purposes of integration? How is it going to help the people that currently live in Evergreen Terrace, even if there are some residual benefits to the community of Joliet? And the answer was, it's not. It's not. So what HUD did was, they looked at the certification from the city that said it would affirmatively further fair housing and said, but you're not. You're not. If you're taking to Evergreen Terrace, if you're decommissioning 350 units of public housing, assisted housing, if you're forcibly relocating hundreds of families to places that may not exist in the private market, how is that really serving the broader purposes of the Fair Housing Act? And so we withheld their block grant money. We said, as long as you are pursuing the demolition of Evergreen Terrace, you're not going to get your $3.5 million of community development block grant money. And you're not going to get it, not only you're not going to get it this year, you're not going to get it next year, and you're not going to get it the year after that. And so with the withholding of the block grant money and some attendant federal litigation that was going on, the case was ultimately settled, and settled in a way that retains a certain number of the affordable units on site at Evergreen Terrace and results in the development of other hard units of affordable housing in other places within the city of Joliet. And for those individuals who are residing in Evergreen Terrace who want a housing choice voucher, they can get a housing choice voucher, and they have opportunities for counseling to make sure that they can use that voucher in a way that's most advantageous to them and their families. So the notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing, at least under this administration, is being taken much more seriously than it has been probably since the days of Secretary Romney. And as part of that, there is, as was mentioned earlier, a new regulation that has been drafted and it has been put out for public comment, and which really further explicates its obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And unfortunately, we can't go into the details of the regulation because it's still in departmental clearance, but I think that folks, it's widely available publicly, and I think that a lot of folks in the room could talk about it more. Thank you.
So I'd like to build on some of the previous comments to talk about one of the key ingredients in this sort of puzzle of affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that's the AI report. So you all work with HUD in one way or another. We all know there's a lot of alphabet soup involved, CDBG, HUD, home, you know, the list is endless. So AI is an analysis of impediments to fair housing. And an AI report is sort of, it's where the rubber should hit the road with regard to sort of turning this idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing into practice and into real change. And the way it works is that entitlement communities, communities that receive CDBG funds or other HUD funds, have to conduct this assessment of barriers to fair housing for protected classes in their areas every 5 years or so. And so they have to, typically the way that it works is that they hire an outside firm to do the data analysis, to look at what are the current patterns of segregation among protected classes, but really most importantly to lay out an agenda for what will be done and how specifically that community is going to comply with the mandate to affirmatively further fair housing. And so I think this is a really important piece of the puzzle. It should lay out a very specific agenda for moving forward. And unfortunately, as the previous speakers have mentioned, we have not seen a lot of progress with regard to specifically racial integration. We've seen some, but I think not enough. And so I think this is a really sort of key part of the process. The GAO in DC, the Government Accountability Office, did a review of AI reports in 2010. And basically what they found was that these reports were really vague. A good AI would have specific, concrete recommendations. It would have a timeline for when changes were going to be made. It would have sort of a list of who within the municipality was responsible for seeing those changes made, and it would be really just very concrete. And what the GAO found was that, in fact, these AIs were more like municipalities that were complying with the requirements sort of on paper, but that those recommendations really weren't concrete enough to lead to any real change, unfortunately. So there are a couple problems, I think, with the way that the AI is structured, that some of which will be changed if this new proposed rule passes. So one is that AIs only look at the boundaries of the municipality. So to give one example, let's say I live in a town that's 95% white and 5% Latino. If that 5% Latino population is integrated throughout the community, that would sort of satisfy the requirements of an AI. So it kind of misses the boat in terms of thinking about regional patterns of segregation. It looks only at the boundaries of that municipality. So I think that's something that needs to change, and that's something that the proposed rule would address. Another problem is the lack of, and please, if I'm wrong, please let me know, but I think the way that it's currently defined, there's sort of a lack of alignment between the AI reports, or that fair housing specific process, and then the broader consolidated planning, the 5-year consolidated planning of municipalities. So I think ideally we would have an AI report in place, and we would have some specific recommendations in hand, and then we would integrate those plans into the consolidated plan. And right now there isn't that kind of alignment. And then lastly, it's the issue that we'll discuss of community input. All of this language it's technical, and I think a lot of the times community organizations don't necessarily have the language to get involved in this conversation, or we don't make it easy enough for community members to get involved. So I think we really need to be more proactive about getting the word out when there are public hearings regarding this AI process, and really really inviting broader swaths of the community to actively participate. And so I think in closing, I wanted to talk about three, and right now, recently St. Louis City completed a draft AI, St. Louis County and Florissant and O'Fallon together completed a draft AI that's still in process. And I think that they could be made more concrete. And 3 of the very specific changes that I think are doable in our region, 2 of them have to do with the Section 8 program. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Section 8, or now known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program. In theory, Section 8 is about housing choice. It's about helping low-income people live where they want to live. Of course, there are limitations to the housing that is covered based on the cost of housing in the region. But in theory, it's supposed to help low-income families become more integrated throughout metropolitan areas. But what my research has found is, in fact, is the opposite of that. That even compared to other extremely low-income households, housing choice voucher households are more segregated in high-poverty communities. And so I think 2 ways that we can make the Section 8 program work better in our region. One would be to make it easier for landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. So currently in St. Louis City, there's a specific occupancy permit that landlords need to get in order to rent to Section 8 vouchers. So, already there is a lot of bureaucracy that landlords have to go through, and locally we add to that bureaucracy and we make it more expensive and more time-consuming for landlords to participate. So I think that local ordinance is, I think, on the wrong side of the coin in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing. Another has to do with our local fair housing ordinances. So of course there are the federally protected classes, but locally we can also write our own fair housing law to include groups that aren't included at the federal level. So St. Louis City includes source of income as a protected class in our own fair housing law, but we don't define what source of income means. So in other cities, they have fair housing protections for source of income, and which specifically includes Section 8 as a source of income. So for instance, if I'm a Section 8 renter and I want to move into a part of the city that perhaps doesn't already have a lot of Section 8 renters residing there, if the landlord refuses to rent to me solely because he or she doesn't want to take the voucher, that's currently legal in St. Louis City. Or I should say it's vague. So we have this source of income protection on the books, but it's not clear whether source of income includes Section 8. So I think by making that law more clear, by specifically naming Section 8 as a source of income, that would be one way to hopefully increase housing choice for Section 8 renters at least. And the third, I think, is maybe a little bit more idealistic, but I would really like to see it on the agenda, and that is thinking about inclusionary zoning, and specifically for development projects that are receiving subsidies, which of course many of them are here within TIF districts or other forms of subsidies. I think if we are giving subsidies to developers to develop housing in our city and in our region, we should be able to attach some additional strings to that. And I think we should consider low-income housing, affordable housing, as one of the requirements that we attach to subsidized development. So I think I'll end there.
We had kind of organized the panel a little differently, and I thought I was going to be moderating it, but I want to leave you with a thought here too. Most of the changes that have come about may come out through regulations, but the real movement starts with the people. As a part of our process, we require our HUD recipients, especially the entitlement communities, to submit annual reports, our CAPA reports that shows how they use, what projects they are planning to fund, and how they're going to use the money. But what we always look at is what community involvement is there. And so we look for community comments. We never find any. Very rare do we have residents that attend those meetings and to give the city some feedback. The real movements of this country have started at a grassroots level. It starts with the community who is most impacted by whatever the negative policies that may be that need to be changed. And so I would encourage you to please get involved and submit your comments, weigh in on these issues, and let our local officials know how you feel about the process and what things that you feel are important that need to be done. A lot of the things that Chris CREA talks about, that looks like affirmatively furthering fair housing on the ground. And those are the kind of activities that need to continue, but we need the community to be involved to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wartts. At this point, let's open the floor for questions. There is a microphone in the center aisle. There are only 2 rules here for those who are asking questions. First, state who you are. And number 2, make sure your question is a question. We appreciate your commentaries, editorials, speeches, and birthday wishes. Well, make sure your question is a question. Okay, no questions. Okay, well, I have one. I'm Tim Lampley, STL TV. And Mr. Wartts, what's the overall theme you'd like for people to take away from this discussion?
I think basically the theme here is that we need feedback, from the people that we serve most. government does not work in isolation. It does not work in a vacuum. So we need to hear from our community members in terms of what HUD, maybe some different things that HUD can be doing to really benefit this community. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is a really central kind of a mission that would help to change this country in remarkable ways. And we need to be able to get some concrete examples on the ground here in St. Louis. St. Louis is a fertile ground here. There are so many issues here that we need to address, and HUD cannot do those things alone. So, if I need to make one point with you, we need more involvement from the community. We need to hear from you, and we need your support in terms of moving this affirmatively furthering fair housing mission closer to fruition.
Okay, we do have questions here. You can state your name and your question. Okay, we're having some technical difficulties. Stay with us.
Okay.
There you go.
My name is Ramona Taylor Williams, and I'm Executive Director of Metro St. Louis Coalition for Inclusion and Equity, and we go by M-Slice. My question is directed towards the regional office of HUD, the district office of HUD, Ed Wartts, who we work with very close, I've worked with very closely. We have a district office here, we have a regional office here, we have a FAP, and we have a FIP. And my question is, how in the world did the north side of St. Louis, where I live, get into the condition that it was in, and how was this allowed to happen over many, many, many years? And what are we going to do from this point to move forward? My other question is directed towards Molly. I would like to see your work on housing policy, because it's very difficult to draft and to frame an affordable housing format when we don't have a housing policy, and if we do have one, I've not been able to find it in the 8 years that I've been doing this work here. And Ed, you're right on cue as far as community engagement and meaningful community engagement on the issues of affirmatively furthering fair housing and moving it. And I would like to see a copy of the draft AI. I think you've already sent it to me, but I'll go back and dig back through.
And thank you for your question, Ramona. And I think it is true that there has been a lot of disinvestment on the north side. The north side has never received the amount of funding necessary to really ameliorate the conditions there. And one of the things that HUD has done most recently to improve that, the city used to just kind of divide the money evenly among different wards, but the money was not going to the areas of greatest needs. And so what HUD has done is to partner with the city, and that formula has now been changed. And so it is more of a formula that assesses the need of the area, looks at the conditions, and then to allocate money on that basis. And I think it's going to go a long way in terms of, helping to improve the conditions of the north side.
And I also want to say something. And Ramona, I want to say something that I know Ed can't say. Okay, I've been with fair housing as a conservative man for 12 years, and my mind is blown. Okay? And I want to say that since I got to this position, I realized that a lot of people in high places really minimize HUD's role in development of the north side. Because since I've been there, I've seen people in Ed's office from Kansas City who really were on the wall about what needed to happen with the way that the funds were distributed in the city of St. Louis. But I'm telling you, the way the political process worked out, it's that what they had to say just didn't come to fruition in the city of St. Louis, and then their hands were tied because the way the federal policy was and the way the politics were at the time, it just wasn't a priority. Affirmatively furthering fair housing just wasn't a priority until this administration changed. So now we see the administration change. We've had cases sitting on the desks of HUD and DOJ that jumped out of the place as soon, 2 weeks after Eric Holder took office. Because when that administrative change took place at the head, then you saw different priorities. So now you see that the way that the office, HUD acts under different administrations is different. But for years and years, I've heard people in FHEO D.C. as well as locally, in Chicago, screaming the same thing about the way things are happening on the north side, but their hands were tied until the political things, the will changed. So I think you're going to see change starting now, especially after Ferguson. But for years and years, it was just ignored.
So
I watched it.
Does that mean we're going to see an investigation into the way that Paul McGee did, acquired all of his properties on the north side, and left this mess that he's left in our community? I think it's time that we see that.
Yeah, I think that if anything is going to happen with respect to bringing light to what is happening on the north side and what needs to happen, it's going to be now. It's going to be now, and it's going to take some community organizing, us coming together to find out what we're going to talk about first.
I wanted to briefly respond also to the question about the need for housing policy information and the role of research. And I just wanted to say that, one of the reasons I'm here today is to meet more of the people who are doing the real work, figure out how my work can connect to that work. So I'd love to talk with you after the panel.
Okay, next question.
Good afternoon. My name is David Jackson, and I'm president of the Board of Education for the City of St. Louis. And I've got I guess a question can be to all four panel members. As you know, the St. Louis Public Schools is up under a appointed board, a special administrative board, and the elected board is not in governance of the district. That has given us an opportunity to sit back, look at our district, look at where it was and where it should be. We also understand now that in public education, there's no more traditional school boards of just setting policy. Most school boards now have to have a hands-on approach on educating our kids. One of the primary goals also is funding for the school district. We have to look at other funding sources because the money is drying up and being withheld at the state level. One of the things that the elected board is looking at is because we're now concentrating on educating the whole child, which spills over into the families, and I wish Chris Kramer was here because we're thinking on the same level as he is. There's 26,000 children that are registered in St. Louis Public Schools. 5,000 of those children are homeless. And so we're looking at how to address that. We also have about 40 pieces of property that has structures on them that we can't sell to developers for many different reasons. So we're looking at, and this is one of the questions to the HUD staff, because I don't think it can be done without HUD's involvement as well as local developers. We're looking at how can we develop those properties for not only housing for families, but also for a boarding school, also for temporary housing for transient families, and being an actual partner with a developer on doing that. It's been done in a couple other cities as it relates to boarding schools, but we're also looking at trying to transpose those empty properties into housing. And we're not developers. So we need to see how we can do that with local developers who have an interest, and for us to be a true partner with them in that. And so I just wanted to see if it's happening in one of your regions, and how does the professional in the end, can you see that being an asset to the community, that the school district is really now a partner in that community? Because Mr. Bryson had mentioned about elected officials. More people in the city of St. Louis voted for their school board members than they did for the mayor of the city of St. Louis. So we are an integral part of the community, and now we want to reach back and try to help with the housing issues, especially with the transit housing, because so many kids every year are homeless. So many families are homeless. And we have all this existing property that's just sitting there. So I'd just like to hear some of your thoughts on transposing some of those vacant properties with developers in a true partnership into housing programs and boarding schools.
So the question is, how can you use those, how can the school district use those properties, 40 or so properties, into and develop them into something more useful, like housing for the students who don't have homes? Is that your question?
Correct.
To some degree? Dr. Metzger, or?
Well, I'm familiar with a situation in Peoria, Illinois, where there is an empty school building where the public housing agency in Peoria, in collaboration with the school district, with private developers, are using a private public funding mix to redevelop that school into housing for 25 or 30 families. And that's part of a larger initiative that's decommissioning some of the older public housing and replacing it with newer housing stock in different parts of the city. So this is one component, but they're using HUD money by way of what's called project basing vouchers, where a housing authority can convert housing choice vouchers into hard housing units. They're using low-income housing tax credits that the housing authority applied for from the state of Illinois and received, and then they're using some private equity as well with the developer. That's a model. I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all in the kind of development that you're talking about. I think you have to look at them on a case-by-case basis and try to figure out what works on a property by property.
Okay, we're only got about 5 more minutes or so, so we'd like to try and get the other people as well. If you'd like to talk to one of the panelists too afterwards, they probably could offer some great information to you. Next question, please.
Good morning. My name is Monica Huddleston, Mayor of the City of Greendale, which is an inner ring suburb city right across from the Normandy Golf Course. Given the history of occupancy permits and the requirements that smaller municipalities or municipalities in the county have, I wanted some guidance from the panel on the definition of the family unit and what constitutes that, because I did get a letter not too long, maybe a few years ago, and it never went anywhere, seeming to challenge our definition of what a family unit is. So I'd like some guidance on whether or not there's law on that and how we might proceed to make sure that we are not running afoul of any fair housing rules.
Okay.
I had one specific place that I suggested you might look. I know EHOC has worked really closely with a number of municipalities to change those definitions, and one place where I think they've made a lot of progress is in Florissant.
Right.
So if you look on Ed Florissant's new definition of family, that could serve as a good model.
And also, Monica, we'll make sure that I get you hooked up with the right person in our office, but we definitely got some best practices when it comes to the definition of family, and mostly because you can see some of the pitfalls that happen, like what happened in Blackjack a few years ago when the family, bought the house and couldn't move into the house. That was a nightmare, and it ended up costing everybody a lot of money. A lot of money. I mean, there was a lot of lawyers that got paid on that, right? So it was good to be a lawyer when that kind of crap happens, but nothing else. So we will definitely get to you. We've got some sample ordinances. It's mostly when it goes awry. We can pretty well predict with certain definitions of family that, Monica, you're the mayor now, and that's great. But on the day that you're not the mayor anymore, you want to go ahead and retire for real or whatever, someone else takes in that same definition, and all hell breaks loose because they see it differently. And so in order to protect people from those policies becoming abusable, there's certain language that we like to see in there, because that way it can survive administrative changes in the leadership.
Okay. Next question.
My name is Glenn Safari. I'm with Utopia, Urban Utopia, and I grew up in St. Louis. I'm back now for about 35. Been gone for 35 years, and I drove northern St. Louis, and the problem I'm having is everywhere I drive at, the regulations meant for business in the cities, the storefronts is all closed in and like prisons. And if HUD give this money to the cities, do y'all also affect the regulations? You can't take a house and build down the window, close the window, but you take a business and do it. So for a person like me who want to build a house in the northern St. Louis, I can't build because I go to the corner store, it's all boarded up. It's like a prison. And until you the city can change that regulations and cause business community, I'm not talking about residents, the business community, retail community to be like Family Dollar, roll up, you know, you can look in the store when you drive by. Most of the stores, I wouldn't even go stop and even look inside of them. So do HUD regulation force the city to do certain permits to make certain areas more equitable for people to move in and have homes and families, and for investors like me to build homes in? I mean, do y'all force those regulations on the cities that y'all dealing with? Because
No.
other than that, you're not gonna ever change the north side of St. Louis, period.
No,
It's not gonna happen.
I just want no, HUD doesn't enforce those types of regulations. They give a great deal of latitude to the cities that they give money to implement their own policies. Great deal of latitude. And it goes back to Will's point. There are probably 3 times more people in this room than HUD has to work on fair housing issues in Region 5, a 6-state region in the Midwest. 3 times more people in this room. The only way that you're going to get the cities to change their policies and to get HUD to make them change their policies is by leveraging the citizen participation mechanism that mechanisms that Will is talking about. The community, HUD cannot change communities. Only communities can change themselves. We can be a valuable ally, but the leadership has got to come from the communities themselves. And to look to HUD to do that is going to be looking at another 40 years of failure.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, can you keep your questions brief, please? We are running short on time.
My name is Eve. I am a landlord of a high-rise apartment. Many of my tenants get $721 a month. Their Medicaid is being cut, and their Medicaid is, they're starting to have to pay for it, and their food stamps are being cut. And we're trying to rehab the building and make it a better place to live, and my bosses keep asking me how much I think that my tenants can afford. Right now they're paying $350 for a studio, and they're asking me if how much more my tenants can afford. That's already 50% of their income. How do I make this affordable housing? Because I have 8 tenants on Section 8, although it's a nightmare to deal with. What can I do? What can I tell my bosses for how to make the building financially stable? Because right now we're operating at a loss.
Okay, who would like to answer?
I think I'm going to also answer that by referring you to another agency. So without knowing more about the context, it's hard to just give you a prescription, but RISE, formerly known as the Regional Housing and Community Development Association, I believe, might be a good resource for you. So I would contact RISE. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, can we take the woman in the back here in green?
Thank you. My name is Edna Hanks-Pipes, and good morning to each of you. My question is going to be based on the comment, land, knowledge, a productive workforce. Land, without land, man cannot build or grow. So whoever controls the land controls everything else. My question is, how many states are in the same condition and predicament as we are in St. Louis, and why? How far in the future is HUD? Is HUD talking about 2050, as I think that they are, and we are in 2014? So what do we need to do to catch up? Thank you.
You know, I work in the, as I said, Region 5. Region 5 has 6 of the 10 most segregated cities in the United States. And that doesn't include Gary, because Gary no longer has 100,000 population, so it's not counted in that calculation. But you're looking at Detroit, you're looking at Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Cincinnati, cities that have serious segregation. And as Ed mentioned when he quoted Secretary Donovan, these circumstances didn't happen by accident. These were deliberate policies that were put in place by public and private interests to basically direct resources out of these communities. And that has been going on for 50 or 60 years, locking in an advantage, a disadvantage, locking in a disadvantage for minority communities, urban communities. It's not going to be turned around in a matter of one administration, and it's not going to be turned around by HUD alone. I'm not sure what you're referring to when you talk about 2050. If there's a plan out there, I'm not aware of it. But there is no single magic bullet that I am aware of that's going to resolve the problems that you mentioned, which are very real and quite severe.
I am the former executive director of the Construction Prep Center, and in that position, I had an opportunity to study land development. But I've also done research from 1492 throughout the world. So what's happening here is happening in Africa, in Asia, and in the United States and the other countries that we're connected with politically. So the question is, again, for me, if this has been in place since 1492 and is happening in Africa and other parts of the world, and I know for a fact that HUD is not in 2014, they're into 2050, if not close to that. So the question is that this forum is an excellent forum, but we need to know what the plans are, the true plans. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just respond just real briefly. You know, I think a part of the planning process also involves community input, and I keep emphasizing that. So HUD's master plan, whatever that ends up being, needs input from the community. This racial politics is so interwoven in the history of this country, it is not something that is going to change, not in my lifetime, and perhaps not in your lifetime, but I think we have to move towards that goal and to be able to set some type of standards and models that we want to work towards in order to get there. But this is not going to happen overnight. It's probably not going to happen by 2050 as well. So I'm not sure where that date comes from, but it's a real issue and an issue that has been with this country since its existence, and you know, we just have to work towards trying to get it resolved.
And with that said, we'll take the last question here.
My name is Booker Gilliam from International Institute. We resell to refugees, and I have been reselling refugees for 28 years, and we have a problem reselling clients with a family of 6 all the way to a family of 12.
Can you please state your question? I don't mean to rush you, but we're short on time.
I've been working with private landlords, so after these private landlords, who do I go to when they no longer can offer me housing?
It's a good question. You're talking about 6 to 12?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well,
it's my 4 and 5 bedrooms.
Right. At least 4 bedrooms.
At least 4 bedrooms.
And you're hitting about as, I mean, you talking about 5 bedrooms. It's a major shortage. That's a house. And to rent a house, I mean, you know, one of the people that I know in the city, Jim Roos, you probably work with him quite a bit. If you haven't, you need to, because he's one of the few people that I know in the city of St. Louis that can get to you with 5 bedrooms, you know, more than one unit. Probably he's got access to at least, you know, 10, 20 units at 5 bedrooms, and that's hard to find. 5 bedrooms is huge as being affordable. So that's the first place I'm going to tell you that you need to contact Jim Roos, and I can get you more information on him in the city of St. Louis as far as finding affordable housing options for very large families. But unfortunately, our occupancy permits don't really reach, because there's a cultural issue there about, you know, in America, we like to keep it small. But in other countries, they know that economically they don't do well by keeping it small. They can't keep it together. So there's going to have to be some shift, and that's going to have to come from people like yourself that are constantly present in these conversations, especially when we're talking about occupancy permits. What are they good for and what are they not good for? Because there's safety, but then there's the issue of, is it restrictive? And what about the definition of family? So there's a lot of conversation that we have not yet had, and we're going to need you in that conversation.
We can further that conversation a little later. Large family issues is one of our later panels. Please welcome, thank this panel, this wonderful panel. Ed, Maurice, Will, and Molly, thank you for joining us. And also your evaluations, you have evaluations you need to fill out. Please fill them out and turn them in at the desk. And with that, we're going to move on to our next panel. Thank you, gentlemen, again.